Rickshaw could buy anything: hotels, private jets, entire islands. But he couldn't buy an answer to the mystery that began the night his autistic son screamed for the first time. When Rick ran into Tim's room, he found the boy standing at his window, finger locked on something outside. Hours turned into days, days into weeks. Tim didn't speak, didn't eat, didn't break his stare. The mansion's security cameras showed nothing. The specialist had no explanation. But Tim was seeing something that Rick couldn't. And when the new maid arrived, she didn't just believe Tim, she joined him. This was the beginning of a mystery that would consume Rickshaw's life for the next 3 months. A mystery that would force him to confront not only his failures as a father, but also a truth so shocking it would change everything he thought he knew about his son. Dear friends, thank you so much for coming around. Make sure you watch till the end to uncover a secret that may save you and your family, because this is not just a story, but an eye-opener. This is how it all started. The scream that tore through the mansion at 3:47 a.m. would haunt Rickshaw for the rest of his life. But it wasn't his son's scream that chilled his blood. It was the silence that followed. Rick bolted upright in his king-sized bed, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound had come from Tim's room. His 8-year-old autistic son never screamed. Never. Tim lived in a world of quiet routines and gentle whispers, where loud noises sent him into panic attacks that could last for hours. Something was terribly wrong. Rick's bare feet slapped against the marble floor as he raced down the hallway of his sprawling estate. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed 4 times, its deep tone echoing through the darkness. He burst through Tim's bedroom door, expecting to find his son in distress. Instead, he found Tim standing perfectly still by his window, one small finger pressed against the glass. The boy's eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on something outside that Rick couldn't see. "Tim?" Rick's voice cracked. "Son, are you okay?" But Tim didn't respond. He never did when he was in one of his episodes. The boy remained frozen, pointing at the window with an intensity that made Rick's skin crawl. Rickshaw had built his empire from nothing. At 42, he was worth over $2 billion, with hotels and restaurants spanning 3 continents. He was used to solving problems, making deals, and getting answers. But his son Tim remained the one puzzle he couldn't crack. Tim had been diagnosed with autism when he was 3. The doctors used words like nonverbal, repetitive behaviors, and limited social interaction. They spoke about Tim as if he weren't there, as if his silence meant he couldn't understand. Rick tried to be a good father. He really did. But running a global business empire left little time for the patience that Tim required. That's why he hired the best nannies money could buy. That's why Tim lived in a wing of the mansion, designed specifically for his needs. Soft lighting, soundproof walls, and all the sensory toys the specialists recommended. The pointing started on a Tuesday morning in September. Rick was rushing to catch a flight to Tokyo when he noticed Tim standing by his bedroom window, one finger pressed against the glass. The boy's morning routine was always the same. Wake up at 7 a.m., eat the same breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast cut into perfect squares, then play with his train set until 10 a.m. But there Tim was, breaking his routine, pointing at something outside. "What's he looking at?" Rick asked Mrs. Cole, the elderly nanny who had been caring for Tim for 2 years. Mrs. Cole adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and peered out the window. "I'm not sure, Mr. Shaw. There's nothing there but the garden and the old oak tree." Rick checked his expensive watch. The boy existed on crackers and juice boxes that Mrs. Cole managed to coax him into consuming while he maintained his vigil at the window. Rick canceled meetings, postponed trips, and for the first time in his adult life, put his business on hold. He spent his days in Tim's room, sometimes reading aloud, sometimes just sitting quietly, hoping for any sign that his son was aware of his presence. At night, he would stand beside Tim at the window, trying to see what his son saw. The view was always the same. Shadows shifting in the moonlight, the oak tree swaying gently in the breeze, the distant lights of the city twinkling beyond the estate's boundaries. "Talk to me, Tim," Rick whispered one evening as they stood together in the darkness. "Please just show me what you're seeing." Tim's finger pressed more firmly against the glass, leaving a small smudge that caught the moonlight. For a heartbreaking moment, Rick thought his son was trying to respond. But Tim's eyes remained fixed on the window, locked on whatever secret lay beyond. Rick began to research autism with a desperation that surprised him. He read medical journals until his eyes burned, joined online support groups for parents, and consulted with specialists from around the world. He learned about sensory processing, about the way autistic children might become fixated on specific visual stimuli, but none of it explained Tim's behavior. 3 weeks into Tim's window vigil, Mrs. Cole approached Rick with an expression he'd never seen before: fear. "Mr. Shaw, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They were standing in the kitchen, far from Tim's room, but she still glanced around nervously. "What is it?" "It's about Tim sleeping, or rather, his lack of sleeping." Mrs. Cole twisted her apron in her hands. "I've been monitoring him more closely, and he's not sleeping at all. Not for days now." Rick felt ice form in his veins. "That's impossible. I've seen him lying down." "He lies down when you're watching, Mr. Shaw. But as soon as you leave, he's back at the window. I've been keeping track." She pulled a small notebook from her apron pocket. 4 days ago, he stood at that window for 23 hours straight. 3 days ago, 22 hours. Yesterday, he didn't leave the window at all. The notebook shook in her weathered hands as she showed Rick page after page of timestamps. Her handwriting was shaky, but the pattern was clear and terrifying. "How is that even possible?" Rick whispered. "I don't know, sir, but there's something else." Mrs. Cole's voice dropped even lower. "Sometimes, late at night, I see him responding to something, like he's having a conversation." "A conversation? With whom?" "That's just it, Mr. Shaw. There's nobody there." That night, Rick made a decision that would haunt him forever. He positioned himself in the hallway outside Tim's room, hidden in an alcove where he could observe his son without being seen. He brought coffee, a blanket, and settled in for what might be a very long night. At 11:47 p.m., Tim began to move. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in his posture, a change in the way his finger touched the glass. But as the night wore on, the movements became more pronounced. Tim's head would tilt to one side, as if he was listening. His free hand would occasionally gesture, making small movements that looked disturbingly like responses to questions. At 2:15 a.m., Tim stepped back from the window. Rick held his breath, hope flaring in his chest. Was his son finally breaking free from whatever had captured his attention? But Tim didn't move away from the window. Instead, he pressed both hands against the glass and began to trace patterns with his fingers. The movements were deliberate, purposeful, as if he was writing invisible words on the window's surface. Rick crept closer, straining to understand what his son was doing. In the darkness, Tim's hands moved with a precision that was both beautiful and terrifying. The patterns seemed almost like letters, like words in a language Rick didn't recognize. At 3:47 a.m., exactly 1 month after the first scream, Tim pressed his face against the glass and whispered something so softly that Rick almost missed it. But he heard it. 2 words that stopped his heart. "I'm coming." The next morning, Rick called an emergency meeting with Tim's entire care team. Dr. Martinez arrived with 2 colleagues, Mrs. Cole brought detailed logs of Tim's behavior, and Rick had compiled weeks of security footage and medical research. They met in Rick's study, a room lined with leather-bound books and awards from his business empire. Under different circumstances, it might have been an impressive setting. Today, it felt like a war room. "I think we need to consider residential treatment," Dr. Martinez said gently after reviewing Mrs. Cole's logs. "Tim's behavior has moved beyond what we can manage at home." "No," Rick's voice was sharp, final. "I'm not sending my son away. Mr. Shaw, please understand. I said no." Rick stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked his front driveway. There has to be another explanation. There has to be something we're missing. Dr. Martinez exchanged glances with her colleagues. Sometimes, parents find it difficult to accept. She was interrupted by the sound of the front doorbell. Rick frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone, and his staff knew better than to disturb him during important meetings. A few minutes later, his butler appeared in the doorway. "Excuse me, Mr. Shaw. There's a young woman here about the nanny position." Rick stared at him. "What nanny position? I haven't advertised for a nanny." "She says she heard about the position through an employment agency, a Miss Kate Green." Rick was about to dismiss her. He wasn't looking for a new nanny, and Mrs. Cole had been nothing but dedicated and professional. But something made him pause. "Send her in," he said, ignoring Dr. Martinez's raised eyebrows. Kate Green was not what Rick expected. She was young, perhaps 25, with shoulder-length blonde hair and bright green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a simple blue dress and carried herself with quiet confidence. "Mr. Shaw," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Kate Green. I heard you might need help with your son. I'm sorry, but there's been a misunderstanding. I haven't advertised for a nanny position." Kate's smile didn't waver. "I specialize in working with children who have autism, particularly those exhibiting unusual behaviors that traditional approaches haven't been able to address." The room fell silent. Dr. Martinez leaned forward, suddenly interested. "What kind of unusual behaviors?" Rick asked carefully. "Repetitive pointing, extended periods without sleep, apparent communication with unseen presences." Kate's voice was calm, matter of fact. "I've worked with several children who displayed similar symptoms." Rick felt his pulse quicken. "And what did you find?" Kate met his eyes directly. "That sometimes, Mr. Shaw, children see things that adults have forgotten how to see." Against Dr. Martinez's advice and his own better judgment, Rick hired Kate Green on the spot. Mrs. Cole was reassigned to other duties in the mansion, though she was clearly hurt by the decision. "I don't like this, Mr. Shaw," she said, as she packed her things from Tim's room. "That girl is too young, too confident, and there's something about her, something that doesn't feel right." But Rick was desperate. If Kate had experience with children displaying Tim's symptoms, she might be the key to understanding what was happening to his son. Kate's approach was unlike anything Rick had seen from the other specialists. She didn't try to redirect Tim's attention or break his routine. Instead, she pulled a chair up beside him at the window and sat quietly, following his gaze. For the first hour, neither of them moved or spoke. Rick watched from the doorway, fighting the urge to interrupt. This felt too passive, too accepting of Tim's unusual behavior. Then Kate did something extraordinary. She raised her own hand and pointed at the window, mirroring Tim's gesture exactly. Tim's head turned toward her for the first time in weeks. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but Rick saw it. His son had acknowledged another person's presence for the first time since his window vigil began. Kate lowered her hand and leaned closer to Tim. She whispered something that Rick couldn't hear from across the room. Tim's finger moved slightly on the glass, and Kate nodded as if he had spoken aloud. "What did you say to him?" Rick asked when Kate joined him in the hallway an hour later. "I asked him what he was looking at," Kate replied simply. "And?" Kate's expression was thoughtful. "He's watching someone, Mr. Shaw. Someone he cares about very much." Over the next few days, Kate spent hours beside Tim at the window. She brought a notebook and sketched while they sat together, occasionally pointing at different areas of the garden and watching for Tim's responses. Gradually, a pattern emerged. "He's not looking at the entire garden," Kate explained to Rick on her third evening. "His focus is very specific. There's a particular spot near the base of the oak tree that draws his attention most intensely." Rick had walked past that oak tree hundreds of times. It was over a century old, with a trunk so wide that 3 people couldn't wrap their arms around it. The area around its base was landscaped with flower beds, and a small stone bench where his late wife used to sit and read. Lisa. Rick felt a chill run down his spine. Lisa had been gone for 3 years now, taken by cancer when Tim was just 5. She had died in the early morning hours, and Tim had never seemed to understand why Mommy didn't come home from the hospital. Kate, Rick said slowly, has Tim ever mentioned his mother to you? Kate looked up from her notebook, her green eyes serious. Not in words, but children with autism often form deep emotional connections that transcend typical communication. They sometimes sense things that others miss. That night, Rick stood at his bedroom window, which offered a different view of the back garden. He could see the oak tree clearly from this angle, and the stone bench where Lisa used to sit. The bench was empty, as it had been for 3 years. But in the moonlight, Rick could almost imagine a figure sitting there, a familiar silhouette that made his heart ache with longing and loss. On Kate's 5th day caring for Tim, she made a discovery that changed everything. Rick was in his home office when she knocked on the door, her notebook clutched against her chest, and an expression of barely contained excitement on her face. "Mr. Shaw, I need to show you something," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I've been documenting Tim's pointing patterns, and I think I understand what he's seeing." She opened her notebook and spread several pages across Rick's mahogany desk. Each page contained detailed sketches of the garden view from Tim's window, with arrows and timestamps marking the exact direction of his pointing throughout different hours of the day. "Look at this," Kate said, tracing a pattern with her finger. At 7 a.m., he points toward the eastern edge of the garden. At noon, his focus shifts to the center, near the oak tree. By evening, he's pointing toward the western boundary. Rick studied the sketches, trying to understand their significance. What does it mean? Kate pulled out one more page, a detailed map of the garden with lines connecting all of Tim's pointing positions. The pattern that emerged made Rick's breath catch in his throat. It was a walking path. "He's tracking someone's movement through the garden," Kate said softly. "Someone who follows the same route every day. Someone who spends time at different locations throughout the day." Rick stared at the map, his mind racing. The path was familiar. It was the exact route Lisa used to take during her daily walks around the garden. She would start at the eastern flower beds in the morning, sit on the bench by the oak tree during the afternoon, and end her walk at the western gazebo before dinner. "That's impossible," Rick whispered. "There's no one there." Kate met his eyes with a compassion that seemed far beyond her years. "Mr. Shaw, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Has anyone significant in Tim's life passed away recently?" Rick's hands trembled as he reached for his wallet. He pulled out a photograph, Lisa sitting on the stone bench by the oak tree, Tim on her lap, both of them laughing at something outside the camera's view. "My wife," Rick said, his voice barely audible. "She died 3 years ago. Cancer." Kate studied the photograph, then looked back at her notebook. "Where is she buried?" "She's not. She was cremated. We scattered her ashes." Rick's voice trailed off as the realization hit him. "We scattered her ashes around the oak tree. It was her favorite place." That night, Rick did something he hadn't done since Lisa's death. He sat on the stone bench by the oak tree. The garden was quiet except for the gentle rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. Security lights cast long shadows across the manicured lawn, and the mansion loomed behind him like a sleeping giant. Rick looked up at Tim's window and saw his son's familiar silhouette, finger pressed against the glass. But for the first time in weeks, Tim wasn't looking at the garden. He was looking directly at Rick. "Is she here, Tim?" Rick whispered to the darkness. "Is Mommy here?" The breeze stirred the oak tree's branches, and for a moment Rick could swear he felt a familiar presence beside him on the bench. The scent of Lisa's perfume seemed to drift on the air, and he heard the echo of her laughter in the rustling leaves. But when he turned, he was alone. He sat there until dawn, watching his son watch him, both of them keeping vigil for the woman they had lost. The next morning, Kate found Rick in the garden, still sitting on the stone bench. His expensive suit was wrinkled from the night outside, and his hair was disheveled, but his eyes held a clarity that had been missing for weeks. "You felt her, didn't you?" Kate said quietly, settling beside him on the bench. Rick nodded, not trusting his voice. "Children with autism often have sensitivities that adults dismiss," Kate continued. "They perceive energy, emotions, and connections that exist beyond our normal understanding. Tim has been trying to show you that his mother is still here, still part of his daily life." "But she's dead," Rick said, the words feeling strange and hollow in his mouth. "Death doesn't always mean absence," Kate replied, "especially not for those who love unconditionally, the way children do." That afternoon, Kate did something unprecedented. She asked Rick to join her and Tim at the window. "I want to try something," she explained, positioning Rick on one side of Tim and herself on the other. "Tim, can you show your daddy what you've been seeing?" For the first time in over a month, Tim looked at his father. The boy's eyes were bright and alert, more focused than Rick had seen them in years. Tim took his father's hand, another unprecedented gesture, and guided Rick's finger to the window. Together, father and son pointed at the garden below. And suddenly, Rick saw her. It wasn't a clear apparition or a ghostly figure. It was more like a feeling, a warmth, a sense of presence that moved through the garden with familiar grace. Rick watched, transfixed, as the presence visited each of Lisa's favorite spots. The flower beds she had planted, the bench where she had read countless books, the gazebo where she and Rick had shared their first kiss on the property. "She's been here all along," Rick whispered, tears streaming down his face. "She never left." Tim squeezed his father's hand and smiled, the first smile Rick had seen from his son since Lisa's death. That evening, Kate sat with Rick in his study and explained what she had learned during her weeks with Tim. "Your son has been grieving, Mr. Shaw, but not in a way that adults understand. He never accepted that his mother was gone because, from his perspective, she isn't gone. He's been maintaining a connection with her that transcends physical death." Rick poured himself a whiskey with shaking hands. "But why now? Why did he start pointing at the window just a few months ago?" Kate consulted her notebook. "I think it coincides with the anniversary of her death. Tim's awareness of his mother's presence became stronger as that date approached. He was trying to show you, to make you see what he could see. And the screaming? That first night? I think he was calling to her, or perhaps calling to you, trying to wake you up to what you'd been missing." Rick remembered that terrible night, the sound that had torn him from sleep and changed everything. At the time, he'd thought it was a cry of distress. Now he understood it had been a cry of recognition. "What happens now?" Rick asked. Kate closed her notebook and stood up. "Now you acknowledge what Tim has been trying to tell you. You accept that love doesn't die with the body, and that your wife is still part of your son's world." The next morning, Rick did something he should have done years ago. He took Tim by the hand and led him out to the garden, to the stone bench by the oak tree where Lisa's ashes were scattered. "She's here, isn't she?" Rick said, settling beside his son on the bench. "Mommy is still here with us." Tim leaned against his father's shoulder, another unprecedented gesture of connection, and pointed not at the window, but at the oak tree above them. Its branches swayed gently in the morning breeze, and Rick could swear he heard Lisa's voice in the rustling leaves. From that day forward, Rick's routine changed completely. Every morning, he and Tim would visit the garden together. They would sit on Lisa's bench, tend to her flower beds, and walk the path she had loved so much. Tim's pointing at the window gradually decreased, but it didn't stop entirely. Sometimes, when Rick was away on business, he would return to find his son at the window again, keeping watch over the garden and the presence that lived there. But now Rick understood. Tim wasn't trapped by an obsession or lost in an autistic fixation. He was maintaining a connection with his mother, honoring her memory in the only way his unique mind could comprehend. 2 weeks after the garden revelation, Kate announced that her work was done. Tim doesn't need me anymore, she explained to Rick. He has what he was searching for, acknowledgement and understanding from his father. Rick was reluctant to let her go. Kate had accomplished in weeks what teams of specialists couldn't achieve in years. She had given him his son back, and more than that, she had given him Lisa back too. How did you know? Rick asked as Kate packed her small suitcase. How did you understand what no one else could see? Kate paused in her packing, her green eyes thoughtful. I lost my own mother when I was Tim's age. I spent years trying to make adults understand that she was still with me, still part of my world. No one listened until I learned to see the world through their eyes instead of my own. She zipped up her suitcase and turned to face Rick. Children like Tim don't lose the ability to see beyond the physical world. They maintain connections that adults dismiss as impossible. Your son was trying to teach you something precious, that love is stronger than death, and that those we lose are never really gone. Before she left, Kate visited Tim one last time. She found him in the garden with his father, both of them sitting quietly on Lisa's bench. Take care of each other, she said, kissing Tim's forehead. The boy looked up at her and spoke his first words in months. Thank you for helping Daddy see Mommy. Rickshaw still owned hotels and restaurants around the world, but his priorities had fundamentally changed. He worked from home more often, traveled less, and spent his mornings in the garden with Tim. His son had made remarkable progress. The doctors called it a breakthrough, crediting new therapeutic approaches and medication adjustments. But Rick knew the truth. Tim had healed because he had been heard and understood. The pointing episodes became rare, occurring only when Rick was away for extended periods or when Tim felt particularly disconnected from his mother's memory. When they did happen, Rick no longer panicked. He would sit with his son at the window, follow his gaze to the garden, and acknowledge the presence they both could feel. Mrs. Cole had been rehired as head housekeeper, though she remained skeptical of what she called supernatural nonsense. But even she admitted that Tim seemed happier, more connected to the world around him. Dr. Martinez continued to work with Tim, though her approach had evolved. She now incorporated discussions of memory, loss, and spiritual connection into their sessions. She never fully accepted Rick's explanation of events, but she couldn't argue with the results. On the anniversary of Lisa's death, Rick and Tim held a small memorial service in the garden. They planted new flowers around the oak tree and hung a wind chime from one of the lower branches. As the metal tubes sang in the breeze, Tim smiled and pointed not at the window, but at the dancing shadows the leaves cast on the ground. That night, as Rick tucked his son into bed, Tim spoke without being prompted. Mommy says she's proud of you, Daddy. Rick's eyes filled with tears. How do you know, buddy? Tim pointed at the window one more time, but his gesture was different now. Not desperate or compulsive, but peaceful and knowing. She told me. She's always telling me. As Rick turned off the bedroom light and closed the door, he glanced back at the window. In the reflection of the glass, just for a moment, he thought he saw three figures: himself, Tim, and the woman who would always be the heart of their small family. Outside, the oak tree swayed gently in the evening breeze, its branches whispering secrets that only children and the broken-hearted could understand. Hey friends, thank you so much for watching. If this story touched your heart, do well to like, share, comment, and subscribe for more. I love you all.